Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this instalment I'm reviewing the latest Marvel Comics adaptation, Thor, directed by Kenneth Branagh. I'm not a comic book fan, so I'm just purely reviewing this based on its own merits as a film. After a particularly arrogant act of retribution that may have plunged his world back into war, Thor, played by Chris Hemsworth, is punished by his father Odin, played by Anthony Hopkins. Thor is banished to Earth and stripped of his powers, where he encounters a group of scientists led by Natalie Portman who are baffled by their new visitor. Meanwhile, Thor's jealous brother Loki rises to the throne and soon becomes determined to stop Thor from returning. Thor is probably one of the harder characters to adapt to the screen because it could either come off as being pompous or being silly, if not both. Luckily, the film does not make that mistake. If Thor's greatest weapon is his hammer, then Branagh's greatest weapon is his humour. He never swamps the film in comic relief, but he knows exactly when to deflate the situation when appropriate. He shows that the film is aware of how ridiculous it is, and it makes it much easier to go along with. The only comic relief character who threatens to tip the void into annoying is Kat Dennings, but thankfully she does not have a huge part and manages to avoid becoming an irritation. A few eyebrows were raised over the choice of Branagh as the director, but mine weren't, because if you've seen some of his previous work, you'll know that Branagh has a taste for the theatrical, such as in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and you need that in a film about the gods. I think one of the strengths of the film is that it makes the worlds of the film unique. The world of the gods is grand, epic and theatrical in everything from performances to set design, whereas the scenes on Earth are much more modest, with more relaxed performances from the cast, and set entirely within a small New Mexico town. Combining these two styles for the two main strands of the film really works well because it emphasises Thor's situation as well as ensuring that it holds our attention. However, this smallness in the Earth scenes is also a cause for frustration. While it may not be as effective as much as last year's Iron Man 2, the film is hamstrung by the fact it has to teaser for the upcoming Marvel Avengers movie, including the incorporation of S.H.I.E.L.D. into the story. That said, besides a few references and in-jokes, the film doesn't become too bogged down in the Marvel universe and mostly works as a story in itself. The problem comes in the movie's third act, which feels small considering the build-up to it, and again feels somewhat disappointing. I hope that when the Avengers movie does arrive, it's suitably epic, because this trend in Marvel movies is starting to frustrate me. I also think that Branagh's command of action scenes is not quite as strong as it could be, becoming a bit too reliant on CGI in some sections, especially at the film's climax. But let's get back to positives, because I did enjoy this film quite a bit. Taking the lead is Chris Hemsworth, who previously appeared as Kirk's doomed father in the recent Star Trek reboot. His choice of Thor is spot on, managing to capture the arrogant, exciting side of the character, and later the charming, humble and human side. His performance grounds the film, and a miscast Thor would have destroyed it. Anthony Hopkins is appropriately grandstanding as Odin, commanding a relatively small part. The Earth cast, consisting of Natalie Portman, Kat Dennings and Stellan Skarsgård, provide fine support. In fact, the film has so many great actors that it doesn't get to use all of them to its fullest potential. I'm particularly looking at Renee Russo, who is saddled with a tiny part playing Odin's wife, who does not even get a line until a good 45 minutes into the film. It's a shame, really, because we haven't seen her on screen for 6 years, and so I would have liked to have seen her get a little more to do. Also not given enough to do is Idris Elba, whose casting has caused controversy. I think more words have actually been said about his part prior to release than really necessary, since he has only maybe 10 minutes of screen time. It's a strong 10 minutes, but still. I think Branagh picked Elba not because of his race, but because he's a great actor. It's a shame then that he doesn't give him enough to do. I saw this in 3D, so I will give you the advice that if you are going to see this film, you should see it in 2D if possible. The 3D adds very little to the film, besides adding some depth to the 3D establishing shots. Quite a few of the film's action scenes take place in darkened conditions, so the darkening effect the glasses add makes some of the film's action harder to discern. It doesn't ruin the film, but it's not worth paying extra when the effect doesn't work. Thor is a fine effort for a rather difficult character. Luckily, the film manages to overcome any difficulties through solid casting of terrific actors and well-placed humour. Unfortunately, it does have third act problems, resulting in a rather disappointing ending, but it's overall very enjoyable, and I look forward to seeing Thor return in the Avengers. Oh, and if you are going to see the film, stick around during the credits, because there is an extra scene at the end, as usual for Marvel films. I'm Matthew Buck, fading out. Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Marvel's mighty Asgardian returns for a second solo adventure in Thor: The Dark World. In the 2 years since Thor left her in New Mexico, Jane Foster, played by Natalie Portman, has been searching for him, and thanks to a rare convergence of the realms, accidentally stumbles upon the ancient weapon the Ether and becomes infected by it, unwittingly awakening an ancient enemy of Dark Elves, led by Christopher Eccleston's Malekith. Thor, played by Chris Hemsworth, transports Jane to Asgard, but soon discovers that if he is to vanquish this enemy, he'll soon have to turn to his treacherous brother Loki, played by Tom Hiddleston. With Marvel's Stage 2 well underway with the terrific Iron Man 3 and the forthcoming Captain America sequel next year, Thor's latest outing is to really up its game and be bigger than before. And believe me, this movie's more buffed up than Chris Hemsworth's muscles. The purpose of the original Thor was to in some way make this extremely fantastical hero somehow able to coexist within the same universe as Iron Man, which it did by deliberately cutting back on the scale and making him human, both in battle and in romance. Now the groundwork for the character and his universe is well and truly established, the Dark World just decides to go full on and have fun with it. For the most part, the action takes place largely away from Earth, and it's Asgard that takes most of the focus this time, as the scope is widened considerably and the Marvel Universe's strong continuity is well in force. The product of 3 creative writers and some well-reported reshoots, the final film is always incorporating new ideas and directions in virtually every single scene and trying to outsmart its audience by pulling the rug out from underneath them several times. All the characters, subplots and surprises are jammed in so tightly in less than 2 hours that at times it can be hard to breathe, trying to swallow some of the denser exposition about the film's MacGuffin and still keep up with the pace, although I do have a feeling that it will play better on a second viewing. While Thor is decidedly more godlike, the darker tone, as implied by its title, is largely incorporated in a subtle sense of mortality creeping in at the sidelines. The Asgardians may live for thousands of years, but they can still die, and it's that which gives the proceedings some sense of jeopardy, even with much more superpowered heroics this time. That said, even though it's larger and tougher than its predecessor, that doesn't mean it drops Marvel's signature sense of humour, thanks to plentiful comic relief and one-liners throughout, although because of the breathless pace, these scenes can take away from some of the lasting impact of some of the more dramatic moments before you have quite enough time to process them. Unlike a lot of blockbusters this year, Thor: The Dark World never makes a burden out of its own self-seriousness trying to make itself feel more important, and instead, like the other Marvel movies, embraces the fact that it's pure, unabashed popcorn entertainment. But the real invention is in the action sequences, which have a playfulness amongst the destruction. All-out war is brought to Asgard, and with the convergence of the realms resulting in holes between worlds and physics going haywire, the filmmakers seem to embrace an increasing sense of anything goes. Even so, the set pieces are well judged, never dragging out for too long, be it a spaceship battle on Asgard that's reminiscent of Star Wars, to a trans-dimensional battle in, out and across London's Greenwich, a location that's surprisingly well represented in terms of local flavour, and while the pseudo-science behind this climax may be particularly dodgy, the pure sandbox execution of it on screen is something that I found irresistible. What's more, these enhance the scope of the world just as much as they destroy the scenery, especially in Asgard, and Thor's hammer, long since free from the snow it's embedded in, becomes a character in its own right. It's a shame that the Dark Elves themselves remain generic and not particularly memorable, and despite having been defeated by Odin's father many years ago, there's very little sense of personal retaliation, the overall plan just being a vaguely defined objective to plunge the realms into darkness and take over. This isn't helped by the fact that Christopher Eccleston's Malekith spends most of his time brooding in darkness, sitting out the more interesting events, his dialogue largely conveyed through subtitles, a decision which robs him of any small chance of injecting any semblance of personality. The only thing keeping these bad guys from being as anonymous as the aliens that the Avengers fought in New York is the presence of second-in-command Algrim, subsequently cursed, a near unstoppable force that serves as a formidable opponent against Thor and the only truly notable villain in the film. Also large in scale is the cast list, as most of the actors from Thor return for the second entry, many of whom were in expanded roles alongside plenty of newcomers, although because of this some of them do get lost in the shuffle. Chris Hemsworth is once again fantastic as Thor, and the character shows some
some growth from the egocentric brute of the original to a more subdued and intelligent hero this time around, using his wits as well as his brawn. Unlike the original, which largely centered around him, however, this sequel feels much more like an ensemble piece, and occasionally in the first half, it can feel like Thor himself moves into the background. He continues to have solid chemistry with Natalie Portman, as the character's human romance grounds Thor, but while her role makes her pivotal to the plot, she remains a damsel in distress, especially with the ether inside her body. But probably the actor who has seen the most growth since the first one is easily Tom Hiddleston as Loki, who was undone somewhat by his uncertain motivations in the earlier film, but since Avengers has truly grown into becoming one of the Marvel film's most entertaining characters. While his role has been beefed up by reshoots, Loki doesn't overshadow the film as feared, spending the first half in the dungeon, and it's later he is finally unleashed, where Hiddleston goes into scene-stealing mode and leaves us questioning when exactly he is going to inevitably turn on his brother, and he remains far more interesting than Thor's actual foes. Kat Dennings and Stellan Skarsgård reappear as Jane's scientist companions, who mostly serve as comic relief, particularly Skarsgård, for whom having a god in his brain means he's developed an aversion to clothes. Alas, Anthony Hopkins' Odin feels a lot more disinterested this time, with the actor not really dominating scenes the way he should do, and the Warriors 3, including Ray Stevenson and replacement Zachary Levi, get very little to do at all. The same goes for Jamie Alexander's Sif, and there does appear to be hints that a subplot between her and Jane Foster as they vie over Thor's affections has been largely deleted from the final version because that's implied but never really brought up again. I saw Thor: The Dark World in 3D, which is a post-conversion job that adds absolutely nothing to the movie. I noticed one effect and virtually everything else was flat, so I'd advise you to see it in 2D if possible. Thor: The Dark World is a solid improvement and a sequel that's much more confident and assured. While it does feel like a transitional installment, or more charitably filler episode in the ongoing Marvel universe while we wait for the second Avengers, then at least it's solidly entertaining in its own right, filled with ideas, surprises, spectacle and humour, so that while some of the individual pieces may be undercooked, it will still leave you feeling satisfied until the next Marvel entry rolls round. Also, if you are going to see this movie, be aware that there's not just one but two post-credit scenes. Without spoiling, the one in the middle is a setup for future movies, and the one at the end of the credits is simply an extended ending that serves as a nice little bookend. I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.